Hi, and welcome to Refactoring with Bob, Episode 6. These are new glasses. Thanks for noticing. I'm Bob. Let's get started. So I thought today we could take a look at something that is probably one of the most frequent cause of very minor bugs that I find, but also the occasional cause of severe bugs, and that is encoding. The fact is, encoding is very hard to get right. It's easy to get wrong, and when you get it wrong, it could either be basically no consequence, or it could be a security vulnerability, somewhere in that range. And so that's why it's important to really think about it and get it right. So to that end, I've built a very basic mock search page. We've got a keyword search at the top. We've got some fake results that I just blasted out here. They're all identical, but they're just, lorem ipsum effectively. And then we have pagination. And the rule is pretty simple. We do a search for something, it gives us the results, and then when I paginate, it should maintain my original search. And so I'm doing that on the query string. So I have this text box is represented as a query, and what I type goes in there. The page is actually the index of the page. So if I'm on page 1, page is 0, but it's all persisted through the query string. These are just plain old HTML links. This is like the simplest possible way to build this. This appears to work great, except when you get a little crazy with your input. So if I search for this crazy string, nothing bad happened. Everything is fine until I click to paginate. So what I've done is I've injected a on-click event into my HTML. Now you'll notice I didn't do the more obvious thing, something like this, because MVC is kind of smart about this. It catches like the really obvious injection attacks, but some of the more subtle ones like this slip right on by. So that's why you cannot rely on MVC to solve your cross-site scripting and vulnerabilities. So let's take a look at how this is actually working and talk about why that just happened. Flip over here to Visual Studio. So I've got a search controller, and again, this is purely just mocked up. I'm putting the title in the view bag. You've seen this a million times. I have a model, and I have a one property that is not coming from the query string, but rather I'm providing, which is total pages, and I'm sending back a view. Just assume that there's something that actually queries a search somewhere here. Let's take a look at the model. In my model, I've got the query. Again, this comes from either that box or the query string. I've got the current page that you're on, which is coming from the query string, and then I've got the total number of pages, which is coming from the controller, thus never bind. I don't want someone to put question mark total pages equals -5 and cause everything to break. It's just going to ignore any total pages you try to inject. But that's a topic for another time. Just know that if you're setting a value in your controller, it's a good idea to make it internal and to set bind never, just so people can't bind that value. So this is pretty straightforward. This is not where the problem is. Let's take a look at the view. So in my view, I've got that form right here, just using standard MVC stuff. I've got a label for my query. I've got the text box. I'm using Bootstrap classes for styling. I've got a placeholder, and I turned autocomplete off just because, I wanted to avoid spoilers. When I hit the quote, I didn't want you to immediately see what I was doing. So, And then we've got the submit button. Here we're looping through our 5 fake responses. And then down here is where we do the pagination. So we're building up a query string manually by concatenating strings. Basically, anytime you're just concatenating strings, you need to be careful. You might be doing something wrong. So here we're building that query string. Query equals, and we pass in what they type, pages, and the page here is an integer, so this one I'm actually not as concerned about. Next, we build the link. So we take the search URL, we inject it into an A tag. We do some stuff to make Bootstrap happy, like adding this current thing. Well, this isn't for Bootstrap, this is for accessibility. But if you're on that page, it's a good idea to put current for non-visual users. And then we build the link item, and we set classes and we do some ARIA stuff, depending on whether or not this is the current page. Add it all up, dump it out as HTML raw, and actually, there's a bug. I don't think I need that semicolon there. So the other thing is, anytime you see HTML.raw, you need to be very careful because you're probably on the cusp of doing something wrong. So by now, I hope you've kind of taken a guess and figured out what's happening. We have the search URL, we have href, and we're just adding those items. So I'm going to pop into a text editor, and we'll kind of manually build this concept, and you can see what's happening, okay? So here I have a very simplified version of what we're doing. Basically, I've got an anchor tag here, an A tag with an href, and I've stripped out a lot of the C# stuff just to make this more clear, hopefully. Up here is the query string that we're building, and I'm going to inject that into this. Not inject, I'm going to put this in here. So we have question marks for where those values are going to go. So we know the page is going to be 0. I'm going to drop that in. Not a problem. Let's put that query that I typed up in here now. So we did oops, thanks Sublime. Okay. Double quote, space, what was it? On click equals, quote, alert, cross-site scripting, end quote, t equals, quote, and page equals 0. So that was what I typed into the text box. This is what's getting put into this. This is just the literal value being dropped in, the quote, on click, t equals quote. If I pull that out and I put it in this space, you can see what's happening. Now I've got an href attribute that equals query equals quote. Now I've got a new attribute because HTML is going to interpret this as a new attribute where on click equals alert. Now this is important. I put an alert so we could just see what happens, but you could put any kind of JavaScript you want in here. And so you could load a script from another page, copy someone's cookies, and then push those cookies to a server somewhere, and now you have the ability to impersonate potentially somebody else, that kind of stuff. And then t equals quote. Now I put this on here because if I didn't have that, it kind of breaks the tag, and so the likelihood that this attack will work is slightly decreased. So I took that out, or put that in. So this is how it gets built. So how do we fix this? So we'll take a step back and think about this. Now, the answer is not don't have quotes inside attributes, because we need to be able to represent quotes inside attributes. Let's say, for example, that this was a link to my YouTube channel. You might want to put a title on here that says, the best YouTube channel ever. Well, I need to be able to put quotes in there so everyone knows I'm being sarcastic. But right now, you can see from the syntax highlighting that this is confusing for HTML. It's seeing title equals the space, and then it's seeing, oh, there's like this random attribute called best, and then there's just this quoted string that's not attached to anything. And so more than likely, the browser is going to interpret it as something like this, but that's not what you're intending. So we need a way to represent these values that are otherwise unrepresentable. You can't just remove them. They need to exist. The way you do that in HTML is with entities. So a quote is actually, or double quote is actually ampersand quote without the E for some reason, semicolon. Now you'll notice also that the ampersand up here is getting highlighted, and that's because this is a problem. You'll notice that I have ampersand quote semicolon. That means the ampersand has special meaning. The HTML parser, as it's reading through this, it sees the ampersand and it thinks, oh, I've got an entity coming up. And so it's going to look for some kind of entity that it knows about. And HTML supports a bunch of different entities. It could be, I think squote is one. There's like, I don't remember all of them, but there's a bunch. You can also do numbers, and so this represents, I think, a UTF code for a number or for a value. There's a million ways that you can reference entities in HTML, but they all start with the ampersand. And so if I wanted to put the best and greatest, I don't know, YouTube channel ever, I can't just put an ampersand there. So the ampersand also needs to be encoded. So now the browser will actually interpret this correctly. You'll see the quote best ampersand greatest, channel ever. What happens if you're trying to encode HTML to show someone how to encode HTML? Let's say I wanted to be funny and make it the ampersand QUOT semicolon best ampersand Q. Obviously, this isn't going to work, so we need to encode that first ampersand. And so now you're going to see the ampersand symbol QUOT semicolon best. Again, I can encode this ampersand symbol QUOT semicolon. So just to be super clear about what this is going to produce, you're going to see in the browser, whoops, not doubled. I'm going to highlight this. Oh, never mind. But yeah, this is what you would see is ampersand QUOT, because we've sort of double encoded this little piece. I'm going to take this out for now just so you can see what it's supposed to look like to get the correct result. The quote best quote ampersand greatest channel ever. So let's apply that logic here. Quote. And then we just talked about how ampersand has special meaning, and the browser is going to look at this and say, oh, there should be an entity, but it's going to get confused when it gets through page and doesn't find a semicolon, but finds like an equals, which is not valid for a name for an entity. Browsers are smart. It's going to say, oh, whoever developed this doesn't understand encoding, and so they probably actually just meant an ampersand. So the browser will fix this bug for you, this ampersand bug, and it's not a big deal, but to be 100% correct, it should actually be ampersand encoded like that. Now, I'm going to get rid of this title. I'm going to move that back in. And you can see that the entities are highlighted, but everything else is a valid attribute value for href. And so now what you would see in the text box at the top of the screen is ampersand, or not ampersand, you would see quote space on click equals quote. It would decode it for you when you view it. So let's give that a try. Now, of course, there's a ton of ways to do this. We're going to do the most naive way first, just to get the point across. And I'm going to do this. Oh, yeah, perfect. So here's where we construct the search URL. Here's where we sort of inject it into the anchor tag. And so here's where I'm going to encode it right before it becomes part of this href. Now, if you're going to try to do a strategy like this, you need to really think about all the different places where you're injecting stuff into raw HTML. So for example, I'm injecting the page ID +1. I could do HTML encode around this, and that would probably be the most technically correct thing to do, except it might complain that it's not a string. Actually, it accepts objects, so it'll figure it out. But this is probably the most correct thing to do. I know that it's an integer, and there is no integer that is not representable in HTML without encoding. So it's not as big of a deal, but, as a best practice, maybe just encode it anyways. Then look for anywhere else where you might have input coming from the user that needs to be encoded. Now here's the trouble I see people get into. Well, we'll come back to that. Let's try this first and see if it's fixed our situation. So I've still got my malicious query in here, and I'm going to hit search. I'm going to wait for the view to rebuild. And I'm going to come down here to page 2, and hey, it works. I mean, the exploit doesn't work. The search works. So I'm no longer able to inject JavaScript because it's properly getting encoded, and so the browser is not going to interpret this as JavaScript. Now, when you're looking through this code, one thing I see happen pretty frequently is it's sort of mentally hard to track what you have and have not encoded. So here you're building this link, you've HTML encoded the URL that's going to be part of that attribute, and then you're looking through this code like, oh, okay, where else am I do I need to do this? And you see, oh, I've got a link, an li tag here, closing li tag, and I'm injecting something in the middle. I better encode that as well just to be safe. I'm sure you all have already guessed that that's not going to work the way you hope it will. Yeah, that doesn't really look correct, does it? Well, that's because we're double encoding it now. And so if we view the page source, come down here to the pagination, which unfortunately is all on one line, but you get the idea. You're seeing all of these encoded entities. Here's that double encoding we talked about. Ampersand, amp, semicolon, quote, semicolon. So that's why you can actually read ampersand quote on the page. That's the effect of double encoding. And you will see this a lot. I see this in RSS feeds all the time. I see it like in share metadata. Someone shares a link on Facebook or whatever, and you'll see, best ampersand quote semicolon things ever, and that kind of stuff. So that's where that's coming from. Let's fix this back the way it should be. And we'll talk about some different encoding. Okay, back to our search page. We've arguably solved our cross-site scripting vulnerability. Probably not in the best way, but it's not as much of an issue now. Search appears to be working just fine, and I want to search for M&Ms, but I don't know how to spell them, so I'm going to call them M ampersand M, and we do a search. Perfect. Let me go to page 3. Hey, where'd my other M go? Well, this is another encoding issue. Let's jump back to the code. So here we are building our search URL. We're doing the question mark. Question mark tells the browser in the URL that this is where the query string starts. And then the query string is made up of key value pairs. So the first key is query equals, and then we pass in our query. Then the second key is page equals, and we pass in that page index. Those are separated by an ampersand. I'm going to switch to a text document again so we can kind of look at this in a little more detail. So here I've sort of taken our query string and just broken it down. So we have the question mark, which is, again, the sort of marker to say, hey, browser, this is where the query string begins in this URL. We have a key value pair, query equals M and M, and we have page equals 1. Now, when we linearize this into a single thing, we need to split this key value pair from this key value pair. We do that with an ampersand. Well, I think you can obviously see the problem is when the browser is trying to interpret this query string, it's going to see question mark query equals M space, and then it's going to see the separator. And then it's going to be looking for a key, but you can't start a key with a space, so it's going to say, this doesn't make any sense to me. I'm going to ignore it. It's going to see a new separator, page equals 1. And so this is how the browser ends up interpreting your query. Now, URLs have a different encoding scheme, but I guess the key point is that you need to encode both the keys technically and the value, because technically, you could do A&M equals 5. There is nothing that prevents A&M from being a key. It just needs to be encoded properly. So how do we encode something like ampersand? Well, URL encoding has a different system than HTML. So it would not work to say, I don't know why I keep putting the T there, but it would not work to say ampersand like this. Now, the browser, if ampersand was a valid value to have in here, the browser would actually do this for you, but we'll get into that in a second. For right now, just concentrate on URL encoding. So how do we represent that? Well, in URL encoding, there's a system where we start something with a percentage, a percent symbol. This is the marker to say, I am doing a special entity. Now then, the special entity for a ampersand is, let me look it up here, 26. And so now, when the browser reads this, it's going to see EM space percent O. It's a special encoding. It's going to look for 2 hexadecimal digits to tell it what that encoded value is. In this case, it's 26. 26 is a representation of ampersand in UTF-8. then it's going to continue. It's going to see the ampersand. It's going to say that's the marker, or that's the separator marker, and page equals. And so a common theme with encoding is that anytime you have a character that has special meaning, also a friendly reminder to always put your phone on Do Not Disturb when you're recording stuff. Otherwise, everyone's going to hear Navi say, hey, in the middle of your recording. So anytime you have a character that has special meaning to whatever the scheme is that you're doing, such as an ampersand, arguably an equal symbol, not arguably, an equal symbol has special meaning. Anytime you have those values, they have to be representable through encoding. And the marker that you use to say this is a special character is one of those characters that has special meaning. So let's say you wanted to search for M%M. Well, the percent sign needs to be encoded too, so that has a special encoding as well. Let me see if I can find it. 25%, 25. So this would get interpreted as M just percent M. And so that's the thing to keep in mind. You will also see all of these characters can be represented through the encoded equivalent. So a space, if I remember right, is %20. Yes. So this bizarre chunk of text here gets interpreted as M%M. We're just encoding these characters. %20 is a space, %25 is a percent, %20 is another space. So that's all well and good. That's stuff you should understand. And remember, I've been applying it to the value, but this also applies to the key. You can have keys that have special values as well. There's no reason you can't. They just have to be encoded properly. So the proper way to build a query string is to have, the properly encoded key equals properly encoded value, and then a separator. And then again, properly encoded key equals encoded value. That's how this works. Now, I know that query doesn't have any characters that can't be represented in plain ASCII, and none of these characters have special meaning in a URL, so query doesn't need any special encoding. Same with page, same with the number 1. So there are certain times where you can shortcut this, but to be safe, don't do this encoding manually on your own. Don't look up encoding tables and stuff. Find a library that knows how to do it for you and use that. So let's go back to code and do that adjustment. And again, we're going to do it kind of naively, but it'll give you an idea of what it looks like. Okay, so we're back in the view. We're looking at the pagination again. Here's where we're building that query. Technically, we don't need this concatenation here because obviously, it's always going to result in this, but I put it in there just to make it clear that question mark is a special character. And I think the compiler is actually pretty smart, and we'll probably see that this always results in the same item, and we'll probably actually compile down to this when you compile in release mode. So I'm not too worried about that, but it's not important. I just want to point that out. So here is where we need to do our encoding. So within the view, we have this nice little helper, URL encode.encode. Again, to be extra safe, you can just encode every single query string parameter. And again, to be really, really extra safe, I probably should be encoding the keys as well. But again, I know that these keys don't have any special characters that we need to worry about. So I'm going to just leave it for now. But again, if you were using keys that you didn't have direct control over, or keys that could be dynamic or whatever, then you absolutely need to be encoding them as well. So now we've got that fixed. Let's check and see if that solves our problem. I'm going to start this over, search for M and M, and then move to the next page. It has persisted our search queries. So we're good. I do want to point one interesting thing out about this. If I view the page source, let's go down here to pagination. Let's look at this link. You'll notice that now it's M plus %26 plus M. So before we would have had an issue where the ampersand needed to be queried, So before we had an issue where the ampersand would have needed to be encoded, And it would have been encoded because we are encoding the URL before we put it in the link. But because it had to be URL encoded, now the ampersand is gone. It doesn't need to be encoded. So sometimes doing one encoding affects the other one. And so you have to think about encoding in terms of layers. So in this particular case, the first layer is the URL encoding. We have to encode the keys and we have to encode the values. And we do that for the URL because the URL is a transport mechanism. It's transporting data, and so it needs to be encoded for that transport mechanism. Then we take that encoded values, all that chunk, and we put it into HTML. Well, HTML is a new transport mechanism, and so that chunk needs to be encoded again for HTML. And so we add on more encoding, which you can see right here, the ampersand. Well, maybe you can see this might be too small. Can I blow this up? Sorry about that. Here you can see the ampersand got encoded because it's an ampersand in HTML. And that happens all the way down the line. So when this gets returned as an HTTP response, there are values in the HTTP response that will need to be encoded potentially in some way to transport it to your browser. When it gets transported to, from the server to your browser, it's going through TCP. I have no idea what kind of encoding TCP does, but I guarantee you it does something. And then it gets transported through that transport mechanism, and there's all these layers. And then once it gets to your browser, it's got to go through all those encodings backwards. And so encodings kind of stack up. URL, HTML, HTTP, blah, blah, blah. And then when it gets done, we peel off the layers of encoding because each transport needs some kind of encoding to work with whatever system it's using to pass data through. So now that we hopefully understand encoding at sort of a low level, I did want to take a second to look at some options for doing this encoding less manually, letting the frameworks take care of it for us. And I'm going to start, I think, with the URL. So here we're sort of manually building up this query string based on the model. And we're building it in such a way that the MVC model binder will understand it. So our model has a query value, so we add a query key. Our model has a page value, which in this case is actually, because of the way we're looping through, it shows up as an X, but we're giving it a page key. And we're actually looping through this whole thing, this model, and we're incrementing the page, but we're not actually changing our model. So that's kind of what's going on there. The nice thing about MVC is that it has helpers and stuff to do this encoding for us, and so we don't have to do any of this stuff. So instead what we could do is search page URL equals URL.action. We're going to pass it in the index. Now, is that right? Index? No. Yes. We're going to pass it the index action of the search controller. And this is going to generate a URL. Now, this is not going to generate any of our query string parameters yet. For that, we have to pass in the route values, some kind of collection of values, which in this case could be our view model. Now, this is going to introduce a bug, but I just want to do this once to kind of show you what this looks like. So we'll start a fresh query. I'll just search for test. And so if I come down here, I don't know if you can see this because of how small it is, but basically it's generating a search or it's generating links where it will maintain the test value, but it will also put in total pages, which is not that big of a deal. It also puts in page equals 0 for all of these pages. No matter which one I click, page is always equals to 0. And that's because the page in the model is 0. So what we need to do is maybe generate new models to have the MVC binder bind to. Easy way to do that is to go to the model, our search model, and maybe add a new method. We'll call this get paginated model. We'll take in a new page index, and this is, whoops, not return. This is going to return a new search model in which, what am I doing wrong here? There we go. Query equals query, which would be this dot query basically, And then the page, instead of taking the one from the current model, will take the one that you passed through. So now in our view, instead of passing in model, we can do get paginated model and pass in the page index that we actually wanted to render. Let's see if that helps. No, it didn't help because I forgot to build. All right, so now I have I'm on page 0. Now I'm actually paging through like I expect. So I think we've improved our search page stuff here. I'm going to get rid of the old method. We don't need that anymore. This is definitely an improvement over what we had, but we still have all this HTML string concatenation where one slip up, if I forget to put HTML encode in here, could be catastrophic. So how do we fix that? Well, let's work, instead of in raw HTML and strings, let's work in Razor. Razor has a very nice feature in that it automatically HTML encodes stuff unless you specifically tell it not to by doing html.raw. So I think the reason that you might see something built like this is because sometimes getting Razor to render things like, for example, this class, where it's different and includes different attributes depending on whether or not the current page is the active page, it's a pain in the ass. I won't lie. It's not fun for certain types of markup changes in Razor, but we can make it work. So I'm going to start by just basically doing the basic stuff here. We'll do the li, we'll do the link, and then we'll do the page number, which is going to be x+1. You should recognize this from up here. Class equals page link, so the class on the anchor tag is always page link. The li is a little special because it can either be page item active or just page item. So for clarity, I'm going to declare a value for is current page, we'll say. So basically, if the model.page is page, then we are on the current page. And I just like to declare that variable because it names it and makes it very clear what that value is and why I'm using it. There's a couple ways you can do this. So you could do, let's see here. Let's do this. You can do this. Class is current page. I see this pattern a lot. So if it is the current page, we'll do page item active. Otherwise, it's just page item. That's one way to do it. That's fine. I mean, it's not horrible. You could move this out, say, maybe calculate it outside of here so you have less sort of visual noise as part of your Razor. This is fine too. I'm going to leave it like this for now. So the next thing we need to deal with is this aria current attribute that only appears in the case that the link we're rendering is the current page. This is one I see a lot of people struggle with, but there's actually a fairly simple solution to this that I don't know, people don't seem to know about maybe. And that's that if you have a class, or excuse me, an attribute, and you have some variable or value in here, and it evaluates to null, MVC will not render this attribute. So the simple way to fix that is to do aria current equals, whoops, I have a value for this so I can read this better. Is it the current page? Well, then that value should be page, otherwise it should be null. And so we can pull that and put this in here. So now when is current page is true, aria current will be a string value called page. Aria-current attribute will render. On any other page, this value will be null. MVC will strip this attribute for you automatically. So that's pretty slick. The last thing we need is the URL, which I'm just going to grab this and plop it right in here. Oh, not quite the last thing we need. There's also if it's the current page, we need to add this little chunk, which is pretty straightforward in MVC, or excuse me, in Razor. So if is current page, and let's get rid of these escape quotes, slashes, whatever. There we go. Now I'm going to pull out all this old dead code. Now you'll notice that I am not manually encoding anything in here anymore. My URL is being encoded by this method. The result of that, the URL, then is being encoded by HTML by Razor automatically. So let's test this and see if it's fixed the issues we've experienced before. I'll start with the M&M one. So we have, if I jump to the next page, it appears correctly. That looks good. Try to inject some script in here again. Alert, cross-site scripting. And we are protected from cross-site scripting vulnerabilities as well. You can kind of see the craziness up in the URL bar, maybe, of all the things that are getting encoded. The looks like the semicolon is being encoded. The equals %3D, you see that a lot. So yeah, I think that's a good compromise. If I saw this in code, I would be happy with this. This looks fine to me. There's one last option that is more appropriate for sort of more complicated rendering situations, but just as a final example and partly to talk about extension methods, I'll show you one last thing. So this last option I will show you is actually a pretty good option when you have very complicated rendering needs, but you want to be certain that the encoding is being taken care of properly. And that's using tag builders. Now this is full framework specific. If you're doing something in .NET Core, you'd probably use tag helpers, or there's other methods I think that might work better. But my world is still mostly full framework, and so I'm just going to walk through that because it's what I'm most familiar with, and I'm too lazy to show you both. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some extension, or an extension, to generate the markup for the pagination links. Now, I could, in theory, just add that to the search model, but to me, that's a violation of separation of concerns. The search model should know how to manage itself, but it doesn't need to know how to encode search links. That doesn't feel like it belongs in the search model. The search model doesn't need that knowledge, so I'm going to put it outside of the search model, but I'm just, for clarity and for speed, I'm going to put it inside the same file. I wouldn't recommend this, but I'm going to put it here anyways, just for the sake of this video. So I'm going to create a static class called search model pagination extensions, and I'm going to create something that creates an HTML string, and we're going to call this, I don't know, get paginated link, we'll say. So this is going to be an extension method, and as a result, I need to build the extension method off of something. So it's tempting to make this an extension method on the search model itself. And you could probably make that work, but I need to use, I need access to context from the current request. And so instead, I'm going to make this an extension method off of HTML helper of type search model. Let's call that HTML helper. And then, as we know, we're going to need to know the page index because we need to override that or set the page index. So I'm going to accept that as an argument as well. Okay, so to get started, this extension method is going to generate the LI in the link for the pagination. So you would call this inside this loop in here. So instead of doing all this, it would be HTML dot, what did I call it? Get paginated link, and then we would pass in the current page like that. And because this is returning iHTML string, we don't put a semicolon on this because it's not like a method. I mean, obviously it's a function, but it's returning an iHTML string, and so Razor is smart and it's going to say, oh, that's an HTML string. They want me to render it. It's not a expression the way these things are, or a statement the way this stuff is. So for now, I'm going to comment all the rest of the stuff out because this is the stuff we're replacing. So let's start by just building it sort of from the outside in. So the first thing we're going to need is the li tag. So we need a tag builder. You pass in the name li. And then the li is the thing we're going to return, so let's return that to string. And as part of that, we need to tell it the tag render mode, which in this case is just going to be normal because it's just a normal tag. Now this returns a string, which is not an iHTML string, so we actually need to return a new HTML string. And we pass that string value to the constructor. When you pass a string to HTML string constructor, the constructor assumes that you've already done all the necessary encoding. Luckily, tag builders take care of all that encoding for us. But if you were to, if you were to pass in something that needed more encoding, it wouldn't happen. New HTML string assumes that you've taken care of all of that already. So within our li tag, we're going to need an anchor tag. So let's create that. Whoops. And then the li is going to need that anchor tag to be like a child of that li. So let's do this. Inner tag HTML equals, and then this again will be normal. So what we've done is we've created the li, we've created the anchor, we've rendered the anchor to an properly encoded string and set that to be the inner HTML of the li. And then we return that value. So our li needs to consist, like the text of the li, if we look at this, the a needs to consist of the x+1 there. So we'll set the inner text to page +1. And of course, it won't let me just pass in a number, so I need to string that. Now, set inner text will encode whatever you pass into it. So I know I don't actually need to encode this number because it can be represented as a number in HTML, but if I was putting something else in here, set inner text would take care of that for me. Inner HTML, however, does not. So looking at what we had rendered before, we have this class on the li, and the li class can either be page item and active or just page item. And so we need to represent that based on whether or not the current page is, the one that represents the page we're looking at. So I'm going to take that little bit of code here and paste it in. Now, obviously, page index is no longer x, it is now page index. I can't access just model.page, but I still have access to the model through HTML helper. So what I can do is access my HTML helper. It's in the view data and then model. And because this is strongly typed, model is going to be search model specifically. And so I'll have access to page, and I'll have access to everything else that's on that model. I could access the query, whatever else I need. But we're going to stick with page. So if the model is the current page, we're good. So now I know whether or not this is the current page. If it is the current page, I'm going to add the CSS class of active. And then I know that I will always add the other CSS class, which I totally remember and don't need to look at because it was page item like I remembered. And so now we're rendering the li with the active class when it needs it and page item all the time. There's also this aria current value, and we know that aria current needs to be added when it is the current page. Well, again, we just add a check for that, if is current page. And the way we do that is by adding it as an attribute. And so, if it's the current page, we add this attribute, it will get rendered. If it's not the current page, we don't add the attribute, it doesn't get rendered. So that pretty well takes care of the LI. All right, let's take a look at the anchor tag now. So the anchor tag is here. We had the href attribute and the class. We'll do the class quick because that is super, super easy. Add CSS class, page link, done. Now the URL is a little more complicated. Before we were using this URL.action. So I'm just going to copy paste this in knowing that it's not going to work. So we don't have access to URL helper directly. We also, remember, don't have access to model directly, but we do have access to it through the view data. So we can just replace that. It doesn't like this get paginated model because X doesn't exist. We've got to replace that with page index again. And let's see here. Oops, get rid of page there. There we go. So now we've fixed that. So what about URL? Well, the problem is we need access to a URL helper. Sort of the quick, hacky, easy way to do this, and the only way I know of to do this, so please absolutely tell me in the comments how wrong I am about this, but is to create a new one. And it needs some context, so you can pass in the HTML helper, and it's view context, request context. So I've just gone ahead and created a new URL helper, passing the same context to URL helper. And so I can just replace that. So now I actually do have access to at least a URL helper, which can generate my URL for me. And I'm basically using the same method I was using in the Razor. And now I can add that as an attribute. And I don't think I'll assign that to a variable. I will just assign that directly here. And that, let's take a look at this. I know we still have the current span to render, but let's just take a look at this in its current state to see just how far off the mark I am. So do a build, flip over, and I'm just going to do a new search for test. Wait for everything to build. Let's take a look. So we're still rendering 5 links. This took me to page 4 as expected. Test the M&M. M&M survived, looks good. And then the on-click injection. No injection, so that's all looking pretty good. So finally, let's tackle the this screen reader only span of current. So what I've done is I've set the displayable, the page index as a page number, so it's not based on 0, but based on 1, the way most people think. And after that, if it is the current page, I need to render that span. So obviously, if it's the current page, well, let's create the span. And again, I'm going to use a tag helper for as an example, but because there's nothing dynamic about this, like you probably could get away with just typing this in and having hard-coded HTML in here if you really wanted to. But I'm going to use tag helpers, tag builders to create this. If I remember right, the CSS class is screen reader only. And then we need to set the inner HTML to current. And now how do I get that into my anchor tag? Well, when I call set inner HTML, that in turn sets, when I call set inner text, that sets the inner HTML. And so I can build onto that inner HTML. Whoops. Maybe I should do that in here where it belongs. So what I can do is add on to the already existing inner HTML, which I indirectly set by calling set inner text, add a space, render my span. And again, anytime you're setting inner HTML in some way, you just need to be careful that what you've done is already properly encoded. Because I'm using a tag builder, I know that this is encoded properly, and so we should be good to go. I'm going to build this, hop back over to the browser. Let's do a new search. I'm just going to search for test, and page 1 is where I'm at. Let's look at the pagination. So here is page 1, and there is my span current. So that is working. And when I look at this, this is a lot of code to do what we did in Razor and not a lot of code. So I wouldn't generally recommend doing this unless you have very kind of crazy rendering needs, you know, like the kind of stuff where you're dealing with a lot of things that have to be encoded, a lot of dynamic values, a lot of conditional rendering, that kind of stuff. Tag builders can be very helpful for that kind of thing. But for basic cases like this, I would probably prefer to see the Razor. But I just wanted to see you, or have you see that as an option. So I think I'm going to switch back to my preferred method here. But there we go. That's pretty much it. Hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the complications around encoding, helps you understand why encoding is so important, how it sort of layers through all the different transports, and you peel the layers off like an onion, like so many things. It's like a stack. You know, we deal with stacks all the time, sort of indirectly, and this is just one more case of that. So thanks for watching, and I hope you found this helpful. See ya.